From the marshes of southern Spain to the sands of the Sahara and the depths of the North Sea, scientists and explorers have spent centuries chasing a single legend, Atlantis.
Right. And, welcome to the deep dive. We're so glad you are joining us today.
Yeah, totally. Because, you have probably heard the legendary name, but what you probably don't know is how a simple philosophical thought experiment from 360 BC was just completely hijacked.
Oh, absolutely. Hijacked by pseudoscientists, occultists, and treasure hunters to create this massive modern obsession.
Exactly. So today we are taking the stack of sources you provided. And it is a big stack. We have everything from deep ground radar scans and satellite imagery to scholarly papers like Kenneth L's Quest for Atlantis.
Plus the original ancient Greek manuscripts.
Right. And the goal here is to find out why humanity just refuses to let this sunken city go.
Yeah. It is a massive trail of data to synthesize. So our mission for this deep dive is to trace that exact mutation, like how an allegory became a global scavenger hunt.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah, it really is. We are going to examine the actual geography of the most compelling physical candidates that researchers have dug up, and ultimately uncover what the academic consensus really says about this so-called lost continent.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand Atlantis, we have to look at the absolute beginning, like the actual blueprint of the myth.
Right, and it's crucial for you to realize that this blueprint comes from exactly one person.
Right, not a global collection of folklore.
Yeah.
One guy.
Just one. The Greek philosopher Plato. He was writing around 360 BC, and he dropped the story into two philosophical dialogues called the Timaeus and the Critias.
And those are our sole primary sources, right?
Exactly. Every single thing anyone claims to know about Atlantis originates from those specific texts. Nowhere else.
Okay, so how does Plato actually set it up?
Well, he sets up the origin of his narrative with a very specific chain of custody. He claims that an Athenian lawmaker named Solon heard the tale from Egyptian priests during a visit to Egypt around 590 BC.
So it's like a guy who knew a guy who heard it from a priest.
Basically, yeah. According to Plato's setup, the priests told Solon about an incredibly advanced naval empire that existed 9,000 years before their conversation.
9,000 years. And the descriptions Plato gives, they aren't vague, mystical musings either. They are wildly specific.
Oh, very specific.
He describes an island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, sitting out in the Atlantic Ocean.
Right, just beyond the Pillars of Hercules.
Which is what we call the Strait of Gibraltar today. And he maps out a central citadel with a massive palace dedicated to the sea god Poseidon.
Yeah, and this citadel was ringed by alternating concentric circles of water and land.
He even details the architecture, claiming the walls were coated in brass, tin, and a highly precious ancient metal called orichalcum.
Which was likely a naturally occurring copper zinc alloy that gleamed like fire.
Right. And he lists the military specifications too. 10,000 chariots, 1,200 ships, complex canal systems measuring exactly 50 stadia.
Which is about 9.25 kilometers.
Connecting the city to the sea. It reads like an architect's ledger mixed with a military inventory.
It really does.
But here's what I don't get. If Plato is the only primary source, isn't taking this literally the exact same thing as finding a George Lucas script in 2,000 years and assuming a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away is a literal historical ledger?
That is a great comparison.
Like, why did people assume Plato was writing history rather than just creating a fictional framing device for his philosophy?
Well, the ambiguity was actually present from the very beginning. Even ancient writers were deeply divided on how to interpret the texts.
Really? Even back then?
Yeah. Aristotle, who studied directly under Plato, saw it entirely as a literary invention. He understood that Plato conjured the island purely to teach political philosophy, treating it as a thought experiment about a state's ultimate hubris.
Okay, that makes sense.
But other ancient thinkers, like the philosopher Crantor a few generations later, took the texts literally.
Why would he do that?
Because Plato sprinkled in real places like Egypt and real historical figures like Solon. He blurred the line between history and parable. And that initial confusion in antiquity, well, it left the door wide open for later generations.
And when we jump to the modern era, that door didn't just stay open, it got blown off the hinges.
Oh, completely destroyed.
The myth went completely viral and morphed into pseudo-history. The sources point to an 1882 book as the major catalyst for this.
Right, Atlantis, the antediluvian world.
By a man named Ignatius Donnelly. Donnelly kicked off the modern Atlantis craze by relying on a deeply flawed concept called trait list comparisons.
Yeah, Donnelly was operating under what anthropologists call diffusionist theory.
Which means what, exactly?
It's the assumption that early human societies were generally static and uninventive, meaning that major technological leaps could only happen if a more advanced culture sailed over and introduced them.
Got it.
So Donnelly looked at the globe and noticed that ancient Egyptians built pyramids and had agriculture. And Mesoamerican cultures, thousands of miles away, also built pyramids and had agriculture.
So instead of assuming that two different groups of smart human beings figured out how to farm and stack rocks on their own, Donnelly argued they must have inherited these skills from a highly advanced mother culture.
Yep, that sat right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, Atlantis.
But the problem with Donnelly's trait list comparison is that it relies on extreme confirmation bias.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yes, both cultures built pyramids, but Egyptian pyramids were smooth-sided sealed tombs for pharaohs.
Right.
Mesoamerican pyramids were stepped, open-air temples for active rituals. They look similar simply because if you were an ancient architect without structural steel, stacking heavy stones in a wide-based triangle is the only physical way to build something incredibly tall without it collapsing.
Exactly. It's like assuming that because two completely isolated cultures both invented noodles, they must have been secretly taught by a single ancient noodle master.
Noodle master, yes.
Who just sailed the globe spreading the gospel of pasta. It completely ignores basic human ingenuity. We are perfectly capable of inventing pyramids or noodles on our own.
We really are. But Donnelly's book was a massive bestseller anyway, and it inspired a wave of esoteric and occult movements to push the myth even further.
Oh boy.
Madame Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, took Donnelly's physical mother culture idea and spiritualized it in her book, The Secret Doctrine.
What did she add to it?
She tied Atlantis to an elaborate theory of root races. She proposed an entire alternate mystical history of human evolution where Atlanteans possessed psychic powers and advanced spiritual technology.
And the historical record shows how this concept of advanced ancient root races was later disastrously appropriated by Nazi ideologists.
Yes. And just to be completely clear here, we are just looking at the facts of how this myth evolved. We aren't taking any sides or endorsing this. We are just impartially reporting what the sources say.
Of course. But it is a chilling historical fact. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, actually established an entire pseudo-archaeological research branch called the Anabe. They used these warped mythological concepts to try and scientifically justify a Nordic Atlantean master race. They even funded global expeditions to hunt for evidence of it.
It is awful. The myth was entirely detached from a Greek philosophical text and weaponized to support a genocidal ideology.
It just shows how easily a story can be bent to serve the desires of whoever's telling it.
Very true. And alongside that ideological weaponization, it also took on a mystical pop culture dimension.
Enter Edgar Cayce.
Yes, famous American clairvoyant. Cayce popularized the idea that Atlantis wasn't just a lost city, but a spiritually advanced civilization.
How did he claim to know that?
He claimed he could enter trances and tap into the Akashic Records.
The Akashic Records, what is that?
Esotericists describe it as a sort of cosmic universal library that records every human thought and event across time.
Okay, so Cayce would give readings where he claimed his subjects were reincarnated Atlanteans.
Exactly. And he famously declared that we would find physical proof. Specifically, he pointed to the Bimini Road,
which is a strange submerged rock formation off the coast of the Bahamas in the Caribbean. He claimed it was a physical relic, an actual paved road of Atlantis.
And to be fair, when you look at aerial photos of the Bimini Road, you see what look like massive rectangular paving stones laid out in a distinct line. It is visually arresting, but when scientific reality is applied, the mystery dissolves. Geologists and researchers, notably J.A. Gifford and M.M. Ball, took core samples and conducted radiocarbon dating of the shells embedded in the rock.
And what did they find?
They found that the Bimini Wall is simply a natural geological formation called beach rock, dating back only about 2,200 years.
Wait, only 2,200 years?
Yep. As this particular type of calcium carbonate cementation forms and shifts with the sand, it naturally fractures into rectangular blocks. It is geology, not an ancient highway.
Wow. Okay, so if the psychic visions and the diffusionist theories fall apart, maybe we just need better maps.
Right. People refused to accept Atlantis as a myth, so they started physically hunting for it on maps.
Which leads us to the global hunt. Let's look at the most compelling geographical candidates out there, starting with a wildly popular modern candidate located in the Coto de Doñana National Park in southwestern Spain.
Ah, yes. The Coto de Doñana is a vast area of coastal marshland. In 2009 and 2011, an archaeologist named Richard Freund led a team to investigate this site.
But you can't easily excavate deep mudflats, right?
Exactly. So they used ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistance tomography.
That's the technique where scientists fire electrical currents into the ground, right?
Got it. Because solid stone and hollow spaces resist electricity differently than wet mud, they can map subsurface structures without digging.
And when they mapped the marshlands, Freund claimed he found massive concentric rings buried deep in the mud.
He did. The data also showed deep-silt evidence of ancient, catastrophic tsunamis sweeping inland.
They even detected a mysterious layer of methane gas trapped underground, which usually indicates rapid, massive organic decay.
Right, as if an entire bustling city and its population were suddenly buried beneath a tidal wave.
And didn't he find some inland ruins too?
He did. In the surrounding inland areas, they found what Freund called memorial cities, like the archaeological ruins of Concho Ruano.
Right, smaller settlements built with concentric circular architecture.
Which Freund argued were built by the traumatized survivors of Atlantis to remember their drowned homeland. He even linked this all to the lost biblical metal trading city of Tartessos.
Okay, the narrative Freund constructed is incredibly cinematic.
It really is. What's fascinating here is how easily the measurements fail when scrutinized. Spanish anthropologists and geologists who have been studying the Coto de Doñana for decades push back heavily on his conclusions.
What did they say?
They argued he was sensationalizing their ecological and geological work. The concentric shapes in the ground radar are intriguing, but they don't necessitate a lost civilization.
Natural geological depressions and shifting sandbars can create similar anomalies, right?
Exactly. So, if the marshlands of Spain are contested, what about the Sahara Desert?
Oh, the Richat structure, often called the Eye of the Sahara in Mauritania. It is probably the most visually striking candidate on Earth.
It is stunning.
If you look at it from space, it is this unbelievable, perfect bullseye of concentric circles right in the middle of the desert. It looks exactly like Plato's description of alternating rings of land and water.
And proponents of the Richat structure theory point to a specific climatological era called the African Humid Period.
When was that?
About 11,000 years ago, shifts in the Earth's orbit changed the monsoon patterns across Africa. The Sahara wasn't a desert. It was a lush, green environment with massive river systems.
So they argue that during this window, which roughly aligns with Plato's 9,000-year timeline, water actually flowed through the circular channels of the Richat structure,
making it a functional concentric island city.
It paints a vivid picture, but the measurements just completely fail when you scrutinize them.
They fail on almost every metric. First, consider the scale. The Richat structure is roughly 400 kilometers across.
400 kilometers?
Yeah, that is an enormous geological dome, 20 times larger than the specific dimensions Plato described for the city.
And it's way inland, isn't it?
Second failure, yes. It is located 600 kilometers inland from the Atlantic Ocean. Plato explicitly described a 9.25-kilometer canal connecting the central rings directly to the sea. You cannot fit a 600-kilometer desert into a 9-kilometer canal.
Yeah, the math does not work. And then there's the archaeology. If this was the hub of an incredibly advanced metalworking naval empire, the ground should be littered with Bronze Age artifacts.
But instead, the artifacts excavated at the Richat structure are predominantly Acheulean stone tools. Primitive hand axes and cleavers from the Paleolithic era. They weren't made by advanced metallurgists. They were chipped out of rock by ancient hominids like Homo erectus hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Oh, wow. So it was an ancient tool factory for early human ancestors, not a highly intense metropolis with walls coated in precious metals. Okay, so Spain's radar scans are contested, and the Sahara is too big and full of Stone Age axes. What if we stop looking on land and actually look for a sunken landmass?
You mean Doggerland?
Yes, Doggerland. This was a massive stretch of land in the North Sea connecting Britain to mainland Europe. And we know for a historical fact that it actually did sink beneath the waves.
It fits the sunken land motif perfectly. Doggerland was a thriving ecosystem that was gradually inundated as Ice Age glaciers melted and sea levels rose over thousands of years.
And it had a sudden end, right?
It did. Its final fatal blow came from the Storegga slide around 6200 BC, which was a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway that triggered a catastrophic tsunami, wiping out whatever coastal land remained.
I'm guessing if you dive down there, you aren't finding brass walls or sunken chariots.
You find exactly what you'd expect from 6200 BC Europe. Dredging operations in the North Sea constantly pull up artifacts from Doggerland, but they are Mesolithic bone harpoons, flint tools, and the remains of mammoths.
So populated by nomadic hunter-gatherers.
Completely lacks any of the advanced architectural ruins, the deep water harbors, or the metallurgy that defined Plato's Atlantis.
So Spain, the Sahara, and Doggerland all fail the test. Maybe we are looking for the wrong type of catastrophe.
What do you mean?
What if we look for an actual, confirmed, highly advanced historical civilization that was famously wiped out by a massive volcano?
Ah, the Minoan mirage.
Exactly. This is arguably the most persistent and widely debated academic theory out there, that Atlantis was actually a distorted memory of Minoan Crete and the nearby volcanic island of Santorini.
Known in antiquity as Thera. Yes, the Minoan theory has a long academic pedigree. It was first floated by a French scientist named Louis Figuier in 1872, but it was heavily championed by the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos in the 1930s.
And when you look at the Minoan civilization, they were staggeringly advanced for the 16th century BC.
Absolutely. Excavations at the site of Akrotiri on the island of Santorini reveal a bustling society with three-story buildings, vibrant frescoes,
and astonishingly complex indoor plumbing featuring running hot and cold water.
which is incredible for that time. They were a supreme naval power dominating the Mediterranean trade routes.
And then the Thera volcano erupts, blowing the center out of the island and sending tsunamis crashing into Crete. It sounds exactly like Atlantis.
It does. But there's a glaring issue: Plato's timeline and dimensions.
Right. Plato said Atlantis fell 9,000 years before Solon, which would be around 9500 BC. The Minoans existed in 1500 BC.
And Plato said Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined. Crete is a small island.
But here's where it gets really interesting. In 1969, a seismologist named Angelos Gallinopoulos proposed the math error theory to fix this.
Right. Gallinopoulos argued that Solon, translating the original Egyptian records, simply misread the numerical symbols.
How does that work?
While the Egyptian hieroglyphic system was base 10, Gallinopoulos proposed that Solon consistently confused the symbol for 100 with the symbol for 1,000.
So if you assume this translation error and divide all of Plato's numbers by 10, suddenly the 9,000 years becomes 900 years before Solon.
And the massive, impossible dimensions of the island and the canals shrink down perfectly to the exact size of Minoan Crete. The puzzle pieces suddenly lock together perfectly.
It sounds brilliant until you actually look at the Egyptian hieroglyphs. I was looking at Kenneth Fetter's dismantling of this theory in the source material.
It's pretty brutal.
It really is. The Egyptian symbol for 100 is a picture of a coiled rope. The symbol for 1,000 is a picture of a lotus flower.
Right.
So this whole theory relies on Solon, a highly educated statesman, looking at a literal flower and confusing it with a rope. Repeatedly, across an entire manuscript.
Yeah, that's not a mathematical translation error. That is just a hallucination.
Totally. So linguistically, it falls apart.
But the physical evidence from modern archaeology is even more devastating. Scientists needed to date the exact moment the Thera volcano erupted. They found a tree twig buried deep within the volcanic ash layer on Santorini.
And because of radiocarbon dating, they could use that twig like a microscopic stopwatch.
Exactly. When the tree was alive, it absorbed carbon-14 from the atmosphere. The exact moment it was smothered by the volcanic ash, it died, and that carbon absorption stopped.
Right, and carbon-14 decays at a known constant radioactive rate.
Yes. So by measuring the remaining carbon in that buried twig, scientists didn't just guess the era, they locked in a precise time capsule. The eruption occurred between 1627 and 1600 BC.
Wait. If the eruption happened around 1600 BC, but the broader Minoan Empire on Crete didn't actually collapse until somewhere around the 1400s BC, the volcano wasn't the murder weapon. You're saying they survived the apocalypse.
They absolutely survived it. The volcano caused immense coastal damage and disrupted trade, but it wasn't the apocalyptic overnight end of their entire empire that Plato describes.
So what happened to them?
The Minoans rebuilt their palaces, they carried on trading, and their society continued for over a century before eventually being overtaken by Mycenaean Greeks. The narrative of an overnight erasure simply doesn't fit the archaeological timeline. In fact, Kenneth L calculates that if you take all 43 specific descriptive details Plato provides about Atlantis, a staggering 81% of them are completely contradicted by the reality of Minoan archaeology.
81%. That is not a minor discrepancy. If 81% of the story contradicts the absolute best historical canon we have to stop looking at the seabed.
We do.
We have to stop looking at satellite maps of the desert. We need to look at Plato's actual intentions. So what is the academic consensus? If it's not a real place, what exactly is Atlantis?
The consensus among modern classicists, historians, and philologists is that Atlantis is what we call a charter myth.
A charter myth?
Yeah, essentially an origin story that a society tells itself to justify its own laws, culture, or imperial ambitions. It is an allegory entirely invented by Plato to serve his philosophical arguments.
He's world building to make a point.
Precisely. In his earlier famous work, The Republic, Plato outlined his vision of a perfect, virtuous, philosophically governed society. In the Timaeus and Critias, he wanted to put that theoretical society into narrative motion to see how it would behave in a crisis.
Huh?
So he casts ancient prehistoric Athens as the embodiment of his perfect state.
Okay.
But to show how great and disciplined this ancient Athens is, they need a formidable enemy to fight and defeat.
Enter Atlantis.
Exactly. Atlantis represents the archetypal naval empire. It is unbelievably wealthy, technologically advanced, but morally corrupt, greedy, and driven by imperial hubris.
Right.
Classicists point out that Atlantis is actually a thinly veiled, fictionalized stand-in for the real-world, Achaemenid Persian Empire.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
The massive naval fleets, the excessive wealth, the hubris of trying to conquer the Mediterranean. Plato was mapping the very real Persian invasions that the Greeks had recently fought onto a mythical, ancient superpower.
And it was a warning too, wasn't it?
Yes, and more importantly, it was a stark warning to the real, present-day Athens. Plato was warning his own city about the dangers of imperial overreach and moral decay. In the story, the disciplined Athenians defeat the bloated Atlantean military, and then the gods sink the island to punish its wickedness.
It's a morality play. The sci-fi elements, the concentric rings, the flaming metal walls, they were just dressing to make the villain look as imposing as possible.
Exactly.
Which brings a huge question to mind, and I want to pose this directly to you listening right now. When you hear about underground methane and concentric rings in Spain, your brain naturally wants it to be Atlantis. It's human nature. But why are we so eager to ignore Plato's philosophical warning about hubris in favor of a literal treasure hunt?
Right.
Why do you think we want the magical empire to be real, but we completely ignore the lesson about moral decay?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals something profound. Atlantis has become a metaphor for things that are no longer attainable, like a golden age lost to time.
Right.
But it also perfectly captures a deep-seated collective fear of natural disasters. It gives shape to a terrifying anxiety we all share.
Which is?
The realization that no matter how technologically advanced, wealthy, or powerful a society becomes, it is ultimately fragile. It can all be erased in a single day and night of misfortune. The myth endures not because the brass walls were real, but because that vulnerability is real.
We started this deep dive tracing the story of an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules. We've seen how a 4th century BC thought experiment about government and morality was mistranslated by enthusiastic amateurs and occultists into a global scavenger hunt.
A very long, very complicated hunt.
Right, a hunt that pulled in psychic visions, ground-penetrating radar in Spanish mudflats, satellite scans of the Sahara, and wildly imaginative pseudo-archaeology. And in the end, the real Atlantis wasn't buried under the ocean or hidden in a desert. It was sitting on a library shelf the entire time, buried inside a book about ethics.
It is a profound testament to the power of a good story. Once it escapes the author's intent, it takes on a life of its own. And, it leaves us with a fascinating perspective on our own time and the physical legacy we are leaving behind.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about the infrastructure of our modern world. If our own civilization were to somehow face a catastrophic event tomorrow, if our coastal cities were suddenly inundated by the sea and our fragile digital records were wiped out, what completely ordinary, misunderstood fragments of our life would future philosophers dig up thousands of years from now?
Oh, wow.
Imagine future archaeologists digging up a massive data center server farm, completely devoid of its digital context, and concluding it was a sprawling concentric temple dedicated to a silicon god. What bizarre legendary charter myth would they invent about us?
That is a wild thought to mull over. A silicon god. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the stories you hear, keep looking for the mechanical facts behind the magical legends, and we will catch you next time.